Nice evening last night. Me and Ben next to me here, we're going to chat to you this morning about a subject called Silvohorticulture, which is basically agroforestry for vegetables. Just a quick introduction, my name's Andy Dibben, I'm head grower at Abbey Home Farm. We're a farm just outside Cirencester in Gloucestershire. Been certified organic for 30 years, and yeah, we put in an agroforestry system about coming on for 7 years ago now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but more widely about the subject generally.
Hi, oh, hang on, that's shorter than I thought. Hi, I'm Ben Raskin. I work mainly now for the Soil Association. I have a background as an organic veg grower, and I first started getting interested in this about 12, 14 years ago, and I set up a small small agroforestry vegetable system south of Bristol, and then the landlord went bust and I had to move all the trees. And that was all very sad. And I now work partly for Helen Browning as well on her farm near Swindon, implementing agroforestry on around 1,500 acres eventually, we hope. So yeah, back to you.
So it's particularly nice to be talking about this subject at a strictly horticultural gathering. Quite often you end up talking about vegetables at a massive agricultural gathering where you're 2% of the crowd. We're talking about agroforestry at a big agroforestry event where horticulture is mentioned twice, maybe out of 100 sessions. So it's nice to be talking about horticulture, agroforestry to horticulturists. It's the reason I think it's really, really exciting is everyone talks about silver pasture, which has fantastic traits to it. Talks about silver arable, which again has lots of benefits. But I think after what me and Ben have written a book, we did a lot of research all last winter and really went down the rabbit hole on the subject. And as a result, basically, it's such the dynamic potential of an agroforestry and vegetable system is huge. There are so many benefits all over the world. Different people are gaining different benefits for different reasons from these systems. It's a very ancient system. It's been going for thousands and thousands of years, which has stopped in Europe, basically. So it's very dynamic, lots of potential massive gains from integrating trees into your vegetable crops. At the same time, because it's so dynamic, there's just as many potential risks and challenges of doing that. So without a really good, well-designed system, you could massively negatively affect your vegetable production. So system design is absolutely crucial, and that's essentially what we've written a book about. It's too big a subject. I've got to talk about it already. Oh yeah, the key thing when you're designing a system, absolutely key, is understanding the way that trees and vegetable crops interact. It's absolutely crucial. If you get that interaction right, you achieve a really good symbiosis. If you get it wrong, it all goes wrong. You get bad both tree crops and vegetable crops. And so they're essentially two key areas: the way crops and vegetables interact above the ground. So everything that's going on above the surface, and mainly there we're talking about light, but also wind as well. They're both key influences on vegetable production. They're also key influences on tree production as well. And then below ground, there's loads of stuff going on below ground, but put in simple terms, the effects of tree roots on water and what that does in the soil around your vegetable crops, but also the interaction between tree roots, vegetable roots and available nutrients in the soil. So that's one that needs really key design thought, otherwise your trees, with both of those, your trees will rob water and nutrients from your vegetable crops. There are so many interactions though, that we're not going to talk about all of them. We basically wrote a book about all of this. There's so much to learn. But we're going to talk today about the very basics on roots and how they interact with each other, vegetable and tree. We're going to talk about wind and the effects that has. We're going to talk about light. It's a really interesting subject. We're going to talk about phasing, which kind of ties all of those together. So we'll get straight into it now. I'm going to start off talking about roots. Ben's going to talk about wind. I'll talk about light, and then Ben will wrap it up with phasing. Okay, so underground. These illustrations from the book, I'm sorry they don't come up great on the screen, but the basic information will come across from what I'm talking about. The interaction between roots and vegetable crops, basically tree roots and vegetable crops, the key interaction areas are soil health, water and nutrients. By soil health, I mean the effect that a tree has on all the soil life around it. They're key, up to 20% of the carbon dioxide taken in photosynthesis comes out as root exudates into the soil. So they're actively feeding sugars to soil life around them. and that's almost all the soil life will benefit from that, and that effect will cascade out from the range of the trees out into the soil, especially in the form of mycelium. Water, so trees are nature's soakaway, basically. So if you have trees near your vegetable crops and you're getting, like the rain we've been having recently, and you're getting standing water anywhere, the effect of the trees fracturing the subsoil and the soil allows water to seep into the ground much quicker. And by feeding all that soil life, it does that magical thing which it makes it much better at draining water, but also much better at holding water in droughts. So tree roots and trees near your crops, if managed correctly, can be a really benefit effect on water management. Nutrients. So again, depending on how you design your system, trees can have a really good beneficial effect on nutrients. Leaf drop will be dropped every year. You'll get a massive drop of organic matter on the surface from your trees when we get to autumn, if you've chosen deciduous trees. Then you've also just got the effect of roots underground. So most tree roots, in fact most plant roots, they're never just one root that lives forever. They're roots that mine an area of soil, then die, and then roots go out somewhere else. When those roots die, they're just releasing, they break down and inject organic matter at all different levels in the soil. And that organic matter releases many of the nutrients our crops need. So they fuel that sort of nutrient load in the soil. In exactly the same way, if you plan your system wrong, the trees will have a negative effect on soil health. If you planted trees in a no-dig system and didn't manage your roots in any way, your vegetable beds would fill with soil roots. And that would have a massive, just a physical effect. You wouldn't be able to put seed drills through the soil, use loads of tools and things. Water's the same. One of the first agroforestry places in the UK, Wakelins, they did lots of long-term trials. They grew a lot of willow, they cropped potatoes next to them. In the really dry year, they had a massive negative impact on the potatoes because the willows were so thirsty, they robbed water from the potatoes. So, yeah, if you plant thirsty trees too close to your veg, they can have a negative impact on water, not positive. And it's exactly the same with nutrients. So we planted nectarine trees in our glass house. We were a bit slow to do root pruning, and directly next to the trees there's a negative effect on nutrients available to our pepper plants that they're being robbed by the nectarine trees. Yeah. So getting that interaction right, you need to understand the core rooting behaviours of vegetables and of trees. So, this varies on your soil type, how much you're irrigating your crop, vegetable crop this is, and what the vegetable crop is. Most UK vegetables that we grow will root in between 15 centimetres and 60 centimetres deep in the soil. If you're irrigating regularly and mulching regularly, they rarely go down to 60 centimetres because they don't need to. They'll be finding everything they need higher up in the soil profile. Tree roots are a bit more complicated. So, and in fact, what I learned about tree rooting behaviour when I was researching this was fascinating. It's not what your sort of childish mind on tree roots is. So you always imagine as I was growing up that a tree had a massive fat taproot, went straight in the ground, and that's what held it upright. That's not the case at all with most trees. So young oaks, pines, almonds will often put down a straight taproot when they first start growing, but 80% of trees, and of that, is it 90? Yeah. 80% of trees and 80-90% of those trees will root in the top 60 centimetres of the soil. So almost all trees root in the top 60 centimetres. They don't send huge roots way down into the subsoil. So this brings up a few challenges. So that's the same rooting zone as your vegetables. So you don't want tree roots growing out really vigorously and totally intermingling with your veg roots, because they'll rob water and rob nutrients. So you need to do root pruning. And this is something across the rest of the world is quite regularly talked about with agroforestry. It's very rarely mentioned in discussions here. I think often because it's silvopasture or it's arable, where you don't need to do it so much. Arable is much more vigorous, tree lines tend to be wider apart, not so much effect. From research around the world, and I think depending on your soil depth, basically you need to prune your tree roots. If it's a very vigorous tree and it's very nice deep soil, down to 50 centimetres. So a lot of us, I think, who first put in agroforestry thought if we ploughed, we'd hit that, that root pruning level. Actually, ploughing doesn't do it. Not at organic, shallow ploughing. You can have negative impacts on roots. So what we're learning is that maybe every couple of years we have to put a blade down, subsoiler, something like that, deeper, and knock the tree roots down, and then they'll go out underneath your vegetables. If you keep cutting tree roots like that, they essentially remember they don't want to keep growing in that place. And what you'll end up with is tree roots growing up and down your tree alleys, your tree rows, but not going out into your vegetable cropping areas. If you're in a no-dig system, that might mean putting in some metal or some plastic either side of your tree rows before, when you plant them, to do that purpose, so you're not having to cultivate. I'll hand you over to Ben to talk about wind.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so I'll talk about wind. So mainly, when you start planting trees, what you're really trying to do is slow down wind, mostly. And mostly you're going to get benefits from slowing down wind. Now, there are a few situations where you might have high fungal risk, where you might actually want more wind, but mostly it's going to be slowing down wind. And this isn't just a sort of blurry photo that I've managed to pull off some Google search. This is the east of England, and it's soil basically being blown away. It's light fenland soil, and it's very windy, and all of that soil is going to end up in the hedge or in the river or floating out to sea. And Stephen Briggs, who's one of the sort of key arable exponents of agroforestry, his main motivation for planting trees was to slow that wind down and keep the soil on his farm. But beyond that, the other thing that happens when you get in the shelter of trees is the temperature rises. So typically it's 4 or 5 degrees warmer when you're in the shelter of a tree than when you're not. So what that means from a vegetable production point of view is that you can extend the season potentially, because you can plant stuff out earlier or later than you might have done otherwise. You can extend potentially the range of crops that you grow. So I don't know, something like butternut squash that might be a bit iffy because it needs the slightly warmer conditions. You might go, well, actually, now I can grow that. And then you can increase the yields of the crops that you're growing anyway by extending that season and increasing the temperature. But beyond that, there's even crops that are growing fine will quite often get damaged by wind. So and particularly these kind of really heavy storms and increasing stuff we get now, it might be that you get a great crop, but because it all gets ripped apart by wind, you can't sell it. So it's not just about what it's producing, but it's also about producing stuff that you can sell and that you can get top value for. So there's a few reasons. That little picture, which you probably can't see, is like sheep all cowering by a wall. So if you look around you, you see the benefits of being sheltered. Where do we like being on a windy day? We like being under a tree. So I know most of you probably will know some of this stuff, but I thought it was worth just taking back to a couple of key principles when you're looking at windbreaks and wind shelter. So the top picture is showing what you'll get if you have a solid wall or a solid leylandii hedge or something like that. The wind hits it and it shoots up basically and swirls on the other side. So you actually can end up creating more damage if you have a solid hedge. So one of the first principles is getting some porosity into your windbreak, so that slightly wider spacing or a mixture of deciduous, mixture of heights. So sort of getting variation into that hedge will help to slow it down rather than stop it. So that's the first principle. And then the second one, and this is sort of potentially sort of optimal type shelter belt, which might not work in a lot of sort of smaller scale horticultural systems, but again worth thinking about the principles. If you just have one tree or one plant, you're going to get a bit of that eddying. If you can create a gradient up and ideally a gradient down, what ends up happening is the wind ends up being forced upwards and then stays up for longer. So you increase the range of that shelter from the hedge or shelter belt, potentially up to 10 times the height of the tree. So that's sort of worth thinking about. So there's one of the questions I think I get asked more than anything else when it comes to alley cropping is, how wide should the rows be? Or how tall should the trees be? And of course there's no direct answer to that because it depends entirely on what you're cropping and what your machinery is and all that stuff. But there's a couple of sort of key formulas that I think are worth thinking about. One is this height of tree times 10, which is the effective distance of the windbreak. So in this instance, I don't know how well you can see the pictures, but we've got what is a 5-year coppicing cycle of something like hazel or willow. So every year of that, there's going to be a different height of tree, and therefore a different effective length of that windbreak. So year 1 is virtually nothing. Year 2 in this instance, we've got 2 metres high, so that would be a 20-metre windbreak efficiency. So you could potentially have 20 metres between your tree rows and still be getting benefits of the shelter, for instance. And then there's a minimum bit as well, bearing in mind particularly what Andy was talking about that root competition, is you really don't want to be any less than twice the height of a tree, because you're going to get a lot of competition of roots and light and stuff like that. So there's that. Those are the kind of the two extremes, and pretty much anything in between can work, but again depends on species, and we can sort of talk about that in more detail. And then the other thing just to think about with wind, obviously all of that changes if you're on a slope. So if you're trying to get shelter up a hill, obviously you're not going to get very much, and vice versa. If you're getting it down, that distance, that 10 times distance will shrink or grow depending on whether you're up or down the slope. So Andy mentioned wakelands over in Suffolk. This is a picture of wakelands, and interestingly actually where they got the competition with the potatoes and the roots, the other thing they found when they had a really bad blight year was that the trees slowed the progression of blight across the field. So they noticed that in the potatoes that were furthest away from where the wind was coming, they got an extra 2 weeks before the blight hit them. So it can slow disease down. So there's, in a lot of these things, there's potentially pluses and minuses. But in this picture, and again it's a bit fuzzy, what they're doing is they've got a double row of hazel, and they're cutting 1 row of hazel each year. So they're effectively maintaining a windbreak every year. So they're cutting alternate years. So they've got a permanent windbreak, but it's not allowing it to get out of hand. So there's lots of ways you can manipulate some of this stuff to keep it to the height that you want. And actually a friend of mine was in Italy travelling, and he saw a whole field of field beans, and they had all the way across the field, they had step over apple trees in rows, like 2 foot high, just up and down. So that, they're only going to be getting whatever it is, sort of 5 metres of windbreak, but it's still an agroforestry system. So you can design it really to fit almost anything, depending on, and trained fruit is really productive. It's more work, but it's really productive. So yeah, you can be really inventive about some of this stuff. And then the other bit to think about is wind direction, and I've pulled out 3 examples which I don't know how well you can see, but effectively this is effectively a square field and north to south rows. So you quite often hear with alleys plant north to south, and that's mainly to maximise the light benefits, which Andy will talk about in a bit. So in this situation, works really well. I've got my southwest, generally, my prevailing winds from the southwest. I plant north to south. That's all great. I'm also protected against the northeast. Works fine, no problem. We've then got, Andy, would you mind just pointing out the shape of the field, just in case people can't see it? On the right, the one on the right. So it basically goes diagonally. No, it's just the bit in the middle. Yeah. So that effectively, if you plant north to south, you're going to have just hundreds of little rows, which might be all right in horticulture, but certainly on anything bigger scale, you're going to be turning and faffing and creating problems. But if I plant in the direction of the field, I'm going to be creating wind tunnels all the way up, and I'm going to lose any wind benefit. So I don't have an answer for this field, by the way. I think my answer is probably don't do alley cropping in it, but it just illustrates you can have your principles, and then you get on the ground and you look at a field and you go, bloody hell, what do we do here? And it might be that isn't the right option, or you need to change the field or something. And then this is one of the fields we've got at Eastbrook. It's a really weird shaped field. It's got a sort of pointy corner up the top right. It's got a square bit at the bottom. So we actually just thought, well, let's go for curved lines. And it's actually flat. It's not contour planted. It's not on slope, but it's just, Helen didn't want straight lines. It's a weird shaped field. So we went with these curves, and it's lovely. It's just a beautiful place to be. And it's still, it's still commercially effective and efficient. It's a grey system, so we're not doing vegetables. So again, if you had to pull cultivation machinery through, some of those might be too curved. But again, adapt it to the field that you've got. And that's me. Back to Andy.
Okay, so we've done roots, we've done wind, we're now going to do light. Okay, so yeah, sunlight is the most important. If you had to rate resources, I know some all are critical, but light is probably the most defining resource for plant growth, both the trees and the vegetables. For your vegetable crops, if you don't have enough light, you're going to get weak, spindly plants. You're going to get an imbalance. Basically, they'll put out way more foliage to contract limited light and less roots. The plant has limited resources, so it decides where those resources go. In a low light situation, it'll put on loads more foliage trying to find that light, and it'll be an imbalance, not the balance we want as commercial growers. They become, again, any plant that isn't getting enough light and becomes weak and can't perform, is not photosynthesizing enough to provide enough sugars for growth, will basically become very vulnerable to pest and disease. So yeah, too much light is definitely not a good thing for your vegetable plants, and it will all lead to lower yields. Too much light is just as bad. We definitely started learning this, Stephanie, in the lockdown year in 2020. I suppose, as an example, in the lockdown year in 2020, on Abbey Home Farm, we produced the best crops we'd ever produced. We've got a really good irrigation system, and it was just pure Mediterranean sunshine for months and months and months. So if you can capitalise on perfect levels of sunshine, there's no, I mean, our crops look like we're chucking artificial fertiliser at them. We'd never had a summer like that. It showed to me the importance of photosynthesis. It's just so crucial. However, I'd say in 2022, the hottest growing season I've ever experienced, we went beyond that perfect levels of photosynthesis into damaging levels of sunlight. And most of the crops you grow in this country are not geared up for growing in high 30s, you know, potentially soon, no, potentially, definitely soon. I spoke about this yesterday, within the next 10 years, I'm definitely going to have a growing season where we're in the 40s for weeks and weeks. So I think agroforestry is one of the key resilience you can build into your system. And with light, it's going to be shading. I think it's going to be really, really important. Yeah, so too much light, so it'll scorch the leaves of the plant, it'll damage the fruit, burn things like peppers, you get sunburn on them, tomatoes get negatively affected, don't ripen evenly. Very irregular transpiration, so if there's really intense sunlight and heat, plants will cool themselves down by transpiring. If it's really intense, they stop transpiring to save water, and that means they don't cool down, which means all the plant cells heat up, and that causes permanent plant cell damage in the plants. So yeah, it's not the question that gets hotter and hotter and the plants grow better and better. It goes up to a peak and then comes down quite rapidly negatively. Yeah, and all of that, again, if it just leads to lower yields. So we want to make sure that our crops get enough, in a silvohorticultural system, that our crops are getting enough light, but maybe building in future resilience that shade might actually be what it sounds weird in a growing season like this, but I personally think these are a couple of blips. 2 rainy years, I think it'll be cooking next year, and soon. I just think it's going to be a real challenge for vegetables, how hot it'll get. So, to avoid these, or gain these positive and avoid these negative interactions, system design is really, really important, and I think especially when it comes to light. Different crops, different vegetable crops require different light levels. Loads of the crops we grow do not need full day length on sunshine. They will perform, sometimes they'll perform just as well in like semi-shade, sometimes they'll perform way better in shade, in semi-shade for the day. Different trees, I'm going to look at those crops in a second. Different trees cast different levels of shade. We'll look at that as well. Shade cast by tree changes with the seasons. This is I've got an amazing picture to show you about that. It's fascinating. Layout of the trees, how you lay them out in the field. Ben's just talked exactly about that with wind. It's exactly the same mindset with sun as well. And sometimes trying to marry those two things up in a system design can cause some design conflicts. But only the designer will be able to emphasise what's more important and what to go with. Yeah, and then what will climate change do to light levels? I already touched on that basically. It's going to make them super intense and they'll need managing basically. So, I don't know if you can see it, I'll run through quickly, but different crops require different light levels. Okay, so in the summer, these crops only need 40% of the day length. They can be in shade for 60% of the day and they'll crop commercially. Okay, so we've got spinach, got like bok choy, pak choy, things like that, cauliflower, broccoli, Swiss chard, leeks, radishes, mushrooms, rocket, garlic, cabbage, parsley, coriander, lettuce, beetroot, kales, potatoes, Chinese cabbage, carrots. That's a reasonable amount of my crop production can be grown in 40% of the light that it's currently getting in a field situation. So it leaves you a lot of options about you're going to get shade in an agroforestry system. You can balance the negative effects of that by putting in shade-tolerant vegetables close to the trees and in that shade. So, you've also got tree shapes. And so basically, well, it's still on shade, haven't we? Yeah, sorry. You can exploit that what crops like shades and what crops don't like shade. And it's, the best way of describing it is the tree understory. So if you're doing an alley cropping system, in our system we've got 100-metre tree rows, and then there's so many options for this, but like if you're in a limited area, you're going to want to make cash from underneath the trees as well, okay? And that, you're drifting into the area of forest gardening. And I was chatting to someone yesterday who's well into their permaculture, and if you want to go down that route, you can literally have a forest garden in a 100-metre strip straight down the middle of a field producing commercial levels of veg. It's about exploiting those classic canopy layers, so you know your shrub layer, your woodland layer, your shrub layer, and your ground level layer, and you can grow different things. You can crop stack within that area, and then yeah, I mean these are all saying the same things. What we chose to do at our farm, like the focus for me was very much on the veg production and making the veg production better. So we underplanted all of our tree rows were underplanted with wildflower mix. So and that's to attract predators around the veg crops. So that earns me money in a different way. You know, it's not earning me money from an end product, but it's earning me money in higher yields and higher quality out of my field scale production. It's a very versatile tool. You can pick all these objectives out of silvohorticulture and focus on the ones you really want. Okay, yeah, and then so that's the vegetables and the different crops you can grow under trees and how they tolerate shade. You can also very much define the shade cast by the tree as well. So that's really all about, you know, what trees are you picking. If you're picking, like, you know, if you planted redwoods down the middle of your field, you're choosing to grow everything in permanent shade, but no one's going to do that in a veg system. So I think the things that can define it are basically, you can have, well, yeah, tree choice. You have huge, tall trees, but I have to say, for me in silvohorticulture, I think you're talking about maybe the odd ones of those here and there, and then really you're probably talking about more shrub-type species, fruit trees, coppice species. Coppice species are your massive friend in silvohorticulture, because if they get too big, you cut them down and you've got product. So you can literally manage them almost like, you know, a big mixed salad crop. You know, when you want it, you take it. You don't damage the tree by doing that. They're really versatile around like protection from damage, so you can coppice them at the ground level if you're deer fence. If you've got loads of deer across your field, you can pollard them above the height. If you want to graze the field, you can pollard them. So they're a very, very versatile tool, basically. And that's one of the key ways you can manage shade, is by having a tree that you plan to cut down at certain times to manage the light available to the crop. And then, of course, you can just go for small trees. You know, Ben talked about the step over apples. You don't have to. Agroforestry doesn't have to be huge trees. Essentially, any woody plant you planted up the middle of your fields and will provide many of the benefits, basically. But obviously, in terms of shading your crops in climate change, a small level of apple trees, you know, cordoned into a wire that high is not going to fulfil that. But another way to think about it is you can always modify a system and plant in taller trees over time. So it's very reactive. And this is fascinating. So, 5-metre tree, that is, over there is meant to symbolise, okay? Which is what a lot of your trees, if you're doing coppicing, you're growing fruit trees, you're going to be at that height or under, okay? And the picture, if you can see it, shows, this is the north side of a tree, and it shows the shade cast by that tree at, so midsummer, if you're north side of your trees, you've got 17, you'll have 4 metres of shade. So the most shade, you know, it'll be 4 metres of shade. So you can grow right up behind a tree in midsummer with summer crops. You're pretty close to the tree at 4 metres. At midwinter, the shade at midday, at midwinter, is 17 metres. So there's a huge shade. This is roughly on the latitude of London. So it'll change slightly where you are, but like that's a huge difference, and it'll affect the way you crop plan. And I think Ben might talk a little bit more about this afternoon. So yeah, and the key thing for that is we talked about wind direction, and I'm just about to talk about how you line your tree rows up. You can't always put them north to south. With light, north to south, crops either side will always get half a day of sunshine. If you're talking about wind, slopes, soil erosion, you might not want to do that, but if you can't go north to south, that maths is really important. They should define what crops go where near the tree on the north side at different times of year. Of course, if it's a deciduous tree, there are no leaves and there's way less shade in the winter. So that's another thing you can factor in if you've got to go across the light, basically. Yeah, so these are just three little diagrams sort of showing the difference. So in an east to west orientation, if that's what you've done with your tree rows, you're going to have one side of the tree always in total shade at those distances I just talked about. The other side's going to be in permanent sunlight all the time. So pros and cons. If you go north-south, you get equal amounts of light on either side of the tree. If you can do it, the light is the best way of sharing that light out amongst your crops. And then, yeah, with small trees, you're going to get light everywhere all the time. But there's positives and negatives that you won't get the shade effect from those trees if you need them. And then the really important thing is to remember it's just essentially the same background picture of the wind, but it's about sunlight. Those light angles at midwinter and midsummer will very much change if you're cropping on a slope. So if you're cropping on a steep slope like that, if I walked into that field to design an agroforestry system, the first thing I'd be like, right, we need tree lines like that. Down the hill, stop all the soil washing off the hill when we crop it. That sort of system can very much be worked into key line cultivations and things like that. However, if that put me at east to west, across the light, I'd be like, well, what's that going to do to my crops? On a slope, that's massively counteracted. Just like with the opposite to the wind in a way, is that the light you'll get way less shade on the north side of the trees if you're on a slope like that. So you need to factor that into your design as well. And I'm now going to let Ben tie all of that into one beautiful system that makes it all make sense.
Wow, maybe anyway. So phasing is the term we're using a way to sort of bring all of that together, as Andy said. So most of you, I am guessing, will have a crop rotation. It might be worth just mentioning Shumei Natural Agriculture. If you haven't come across them, it's a sort of, I don't know, what do I call it, sort of organics brother, maybe. But they don't rotate, so they grow the same crop in the same place every year. Continuous cropping, they save their seed. And it's really interesting, and it mostly does seem to work. And actually, when you start integrating that into agroforestry, you can potentially maximise some of the benefits. But I'm guessing most of us will have a rotation. And so this phasing bit, in a way, is bringing that annual vegetable rotation where you're assuming full light every year, except possibly some undersowing bits, but you're turning it into a sort of 3D rotation over time as well. So it can work in a seasonal way, so you've got that within each year. So this picture again that Andy showed, where depending on whether it's summer or winter, and depending on whether your tree is deciduous or evergreen, you can work out which crop is going to go where. And there's an amazing grower who inspired both Andy and I, and who actually dedicated the book to, Alan Schofield, up in Lancashire. And he had, for 30 years, he was growing on a 5-year pollarded alder agroforestry system. And his rotation was so complex, because not only did he understand which crops did well in which phase of the coppice or the pollard, but he then knew which crops did really well near the trees in year 1 and further away from the trees in year 2. So it does get very complicated, and as we've said, there's all of these competing factors. There's light, there's orientation, there's slope, and you won't get it right every year, because it's all about minimising risk and diversity. So in a really hot, dry year, some bits of the rotation might do really well. In a really wet, windy year, it'll be other bits that do well. But you're trying to reduce the maximum damage, I guess, around some of this stuff. So there's that seasonal within the year, sort of working out where the light's going to go. And again, things like, you might plant things like leeks and brassicas right up to the tree, because they're going to be growing over winter, and they need less light. They're not going to be affected. There's going to be very little competition if you've got deciduous trees anywhere. Whereas lettuce, you might grow near the tree in the summer because they want a bit of shade, and they'll do better on that list of crops that Andy showed. So then you, as well as within that season phasing, you've also got the annual phasing. So if you've got a big tree on the left, which I agree with Andy, I think they're less suitable for horticultural systems, but you might decide to use them. You've got a gradual increase of size over 5, 10, 50, 100 years or whatever. So gradually you're going to be reducing the amount of land that's available for cropping. And that might be a design plan. So agroforestry is sometimes used as a transitional phase to forestry. And that, in some situations that's fine. I'm guessing most of us want to keep growing veg in the place where we're putting it. So we would tend to have something more similar on the right, where you've got either smaller trees or you've got this rotational coppicing bit. And things like squashes, you get really bad wind problems sometimes when you transplant them. They're really susceptible to damage. So you don't want to be planting them year one after you've chopped all the trees down. So it's thinking about not just the light, but also about other things that might affect that. And there's no template in a way. There's nowhere in the book where we go, here's a rotation of phasing you go to, because it's so dependent on your farm, your markets, your crops, all of that stuff. And then, the other final bit around this phasing stuff is around looking at the orientation, as Andy said. So as well as the timing and the yearly stuff, it's going to depend on, and also your latitude. So the north-south thing, interestingly, if you're at the equator, doesn't really apply. So it's only if you're sort of up here. So some of this stuff is so complicated. Andy understands some of it better. Anyway, that is pretty much it. We have around 20 minutes for questions. We have this book coming out in January. We were hoping it was going to be out in time for this, but it's not, sadly. So, but you can pre-order it, I believe. We did our bit, exactly. So any questions, I guess? Yeah. Yes.
Have you come across any syntropic agricultural projects in the UK?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated in
Repeat the question. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So the question was, I think it's the recording purposes. The question was, have we come across any syntropic agroforestry systems in the UK? I think my basic understanding is I don't know. I haven't been there, and I really want to go there. Which is Martin Crawford's glasshouse, where I think he might be drifting into that at his glasshouse, heated glasshouse set up. But I'm not sure. You have to check that out. I think otherwise, currently in the UK climate, I would say silvohorticulture can be syntropics, just really slow syntropics.
Define it?
Yeah.
Can you define it?
I think syntropics is essentially very, very fast stacking of crops. It comes in the tropics where, and again, it's casual reading, so don't quote me on any of this, but essentially they're continuously planting trees that come up very, very fast, one behind the other. You harvest crops, it creates light for another crop to come up through. It's essentially stacking of, I think mainly like tree and fruit crops in the same space at just different times to maximise light usage, nutrient usage in that area over a set time. It's a fascinating subject, look it up, it's great.
I was actually about one of the specific slides during your talk, Andy, that showed what looked like quite a dense tree cover over salad crops.
Oh yeah.
Tell me when to stop.
I think that's the most beautiful agroforestry picture. So that is,
That one?
That one, yeah.
I'm not going to remember the bloody name. I'm not going to remember the name of the place. That's my favourite. The thing is, it's really interesting. So it's in France. There's a guy, he was all over YouTube for a bit. He was a guy that moved, I think he's Dutch grower, moved to France, and he put in this salad operation in an old orchard. He was posting videos for 2 or 3 years, and it looked incredible. I tried to get hold of him to do a case study for the book, and I had his new email. I got absolutely no reply from him. My one thing, whenever I look at this photo, is whether he ran into trouble after 3 years with trees migrating into what looked like no-dig beds. It looks like a very 40A system, you know, deep mulch, loads of wood chip around everywhere. But those are big old trees. When you stick a load of soil on top of an old tree like that, they'll migrate unless you're tilling. So I just wonder if he didn't want to get involved in the butcher, he'd run into problems. But yeah, it definitely worked very, very well. And like Ben said, it could be a transitional thing. You know, one of the oldest forms of silvohorticulture I came across, it was just huge. It was in Kent for a long, long time when they were establishing new apple orchards. They would make use of the space in the best way. When they planted very young new lines of trees, all between the trees was veg production. So they when they weren't earning anything of the apples, they were earning loads and loads of veg production. Then when the apples got big enough, they needed to access the rows for harvest and stuff like that, they stopped the veg production. So you can see it. I really like, the more we research it, the idea that if you've got, like, I don't know, especially if someone owns their own farm, I don't, but if you owned your own farm, to plan a system where you rotated over time, like pasture fields, woodland fields, veg fields, in that sort of model would be fantastic, I think. Yeah. But I think you could move in, I think you could move in under an orchard, deep mulch it like that, 3 years of salad production, and then move somewhere else, you know? You can be transient.
At the back, yeah.
In terms of root management,
Oh, sorry, go on.
what sort of, you said you were sending a blade down into the soil to cut the roots. Can you tell us a bit more about, is it a special type of blade? Or?
Was that the question about root management?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, a question about what sort of blade you use to manage trees. So the one I've seen pictures from other parts of the world where they've purpose built a fairly hefty looking, essentially sort of very deep kitchen knife, you know, an agricultural kitchen knife. But I think the more realistic versions in this country, and I think it's interesting. So where I am, where we farm, we're on with Cotswold brash. It's very shallow, 15 centimetres of soil, and then you kind of start hitting like 70–80% rock. Now, like crop roots, tree roots, they won't actively really fight to go through it. So our soil, I'm predicting on ours that we won't have to. I couldn't get a blade 5 meters deep into. 50 centimeters deep into that soil. I'd be running a blade through like mostly rock, basically. But I think that'll have the same limiting factors on the roots. So I think I'm going to have to root prune down to the level that the trees are going to. But in a UK environment, I think you're talking subsoiler is what you're going to be using for it. Or, you know, maybe modified and sharpened up a bit.
And the challenge then as well is sort of offsetting it enough that you can sort of get it near enough the tree, because obviously normally the subsoil would be right behind the tractor, and then you've kind of got a couple of metres where you might not be doing it.
So maybe like a machete or something like that.
Yeah. But the other bit then is, you know, if that's going to be an issue, is then choosing the right tree.
Yeah.
So, you know, the prunus species particularly are really suckering and invasive with their roots. And I think Tolly's had some problems here, hasn't he, with some of the cherries. So actually, you know, choosing prunus species for small agroforestry systems might not be a great idea, and you're better off going with something that's less vigorous, that you maybe only have to do every couple of years, or, you know, so you can modify that with the planning as well.
So you've got to be careful with the rootstock then.
Oh yeah, I meant to mention that actually. That's a really important part of it. Is like the root, especially if you're going fruit trees, the rootstock's a really good way of managing that. So one of the case studies in the book is Nathan Richards from West Wales, and he's growing loads of prunus stuff in his polytunnels, and they're on quite a small rootstock, and he hasn't run into very many problems with it interfering with his vegetable crops. We planted nectarines in our glass house to provide dappled shade. This is like future-proofing resilient stuff for climate. Glass house gets the light intensity in the hot years is really intense. Shading is really, really expensive. On a small scale, you can root prune with a spade. That's what we do in the glass house. We just literally dig a deep trench, and you can kind of see it, especially these are nectarines. They were very shallow. You can see when you dig the trench how deep you need to go. It's not very deep. You can see where most of the roots are. And we do that now. We're going to do that, I think, like every couple of years, and just put wood chip in. Just easy to dig out the next time, start growing through the wood chip. So on a small market garden scale, spade. Or putting in barriers, like good rootstock, smaller size of tree, or just putting in physical barriers when you plant the trees.
You get the pigs in there.
What time of year are you doing your root pruning?
What time of
Okay,
year?
so in the glass house, when I noticed it was robbing nutrients from the crops around it, was the first time I did it. Now we're doing it in the winter.
Sorry. There was one in the middle and one. I didn't see. Anyway, someone. Yeah.
I've not messed around with trees for a while, but I remember two things. One was lime trees. Have you seen any experiments with using pollarded lime trees, because they're quite a valuable leaf in April, May? I just thought it would always be a good idea to have a nice salad leaf, and they produce an abundance of salad leaves. So I wondered if you'd just seen a project that had just used lime trees for salad leaves.
Yeah, so that was a question about whether we've seen a lime tree system, and I guess mulberry would be similar, where you could do that for sale. I haven't. Are you saying that you've seen one at the back there, or is that
No,
you?
I've got a question.
Okay, I'll come to you after. Yeah, so no, I haven't this chance, but yeah, there's no reason why not. I mean, most deciduous trees can be coppiced or pollarded, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, lime is a famously pollarded tree. In Old English woodland culture, it's one of the pollarded trees for crops. So
But it vigorously suckers, so you're back into prunus problems, I would suggest.
yeah.
Yeah, at the back.
How do you manage long term the management underneath the trees? Because we've got old rows of apple trees, and it's great for biodiversity. We've kind of left it to go wild, but then when it comes to harvesting the apples, it's an absolute nightmare.
So that was a question about managing the understory, and particularly with older trees. And actually, we've run into the same. We've been harvesting our almonds in the last couple of weeks, and we didn't quite cut the grass short enough. So we're sort of rooting around the long grass looking for almonds. So yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, grazing, as long as you get them out, you need sort of a couple of months between grazing and harvesting. So that can be a way of doing it.
Just on the strip.
Or offset mowers is the other way. So just having something that can go right up to the trees, or tarpaulins and shaking them down, for the harvesting bit. But yeah, any other thoughts on managing?
I mean, the classic question is always, I think one of the, people who've already put in systems are always like, I wish we thought about the understory before we planted the trees. And if anyone's designing a system, we massively emphasise in the book that one of the key parts of system design, and in fact, for me, it'd always be the first thing I'd put in before the trees, would be the understory. So that you can, one key thing there is, when we put in our tree rows, we weeded them the whole summer before we planted trees. We cultivated the tree rows just to get on top of perennial weeds. They came out of essentially a full-scale veg operation. And then we sowed our wildflowers in the autumn, and then we planted the trees in February, and the process of digging the holes for planting the trees just weeded out the wildflowers, and then we wood chipped every tree. But yeah, post-management of understory is definitely tricky. I've got rows that I put in as beetle banks, so just tusky grasses underneath, and they've very quickly gone into succession. So there's now a lot of brambles in those rows. The other thing we're managing, we've had a couple of really wet years. We've got a bit of scab in some of the trees. Removing damp, diseased leaves and fruit from under the trees. It's very difficult when there's brambles everywhere. So I think we're going to move into a mowing operation under those trees. Long term, what I want to do is we're going to, like Ben said, they're shorter rows. So they're 30. I've got 10, 30 metre rows of apple trees. We're going to put black plastic under the trees and get some actual cropping in under there, so rhubarb, soft fruit, things like that.
But I do think, unless you're stock free, I think bringing animals into the system, whether it's poultry or sheep occasionally, if you can protect the trees, I think they can do a really good job without you having to put a lot of effort into it. So, but obviously it doesn't work for everybody.
We put chickens under, but if you've got veg coming right up to it, it's quite a big setup for one strip of trees.
Yeah, it's not always easy. On the left.
Oh, just to add to it, I would say a strimmer is the obvious thing to me to use. We use a strimmer at work, but you do have to protect each tree before you get the strimmer out with some heavy piping or something. Otherwise it's game over.
Strimmer obviously does work, but it is time consuming and expensive. We've got quite a big area of Perry pears in one of our fields, and I strimmed it the first year and I thought, oh my God, I'm not doing that again. took like about a week. and they, the weeds were back. I mean, but that, there was...
It's about scale,
Yeah.
basically. If it's a 1 acre market garden and you've got 5 or 6 tree lines and you're strimming them twice a year, it's not a big deal. If it's a big field scale operation, you've got 100 metre rows, you're a nutter if you're going to deal with the string.
Yes.
Another question about tree species. I know that certain tree species fix nitrogen, and I wondered if there were any evidence of getting a beneficial effect of using agroforestry trees that fix nitrogen, like alder.
So that was a question about nitrogen fixing trees, and this is again really fascinating. So the nitrogen fixing trees don't have more nitrogen in each leaf, but they do produce about 25% more leaf than non-nitrogen fixing, which is quite interesting. So you are getting a benefit actually just from that increased leaf matter. There's also then potentially, if you start chipping it and adding it back into the soil, either as rainwater wood chip or even sort of mulched on the row, and then it will find its way out. And then there's really interesting stuff going on with perennial green manures, so not necessarily tree species, but sort of perennial species with Clow, Ward and others in Wales. There's really interesting stuff come out recently. So yes, there is plenty of evidence that it can work really well. And there's quite a lot of stuff I'm trying to think now, I remember reading it in India, they did quite a lot of work on nitrogen fixing trees and bring that into it. So yeah, no, definitely it can work.
I think it's important to say though, don't imagine a concept where you've got loads of alder trees and loads of vegetables and the alder trees just feed all the vegetables without you doing anything. And nitrogen fixing it's very local around the tree. So unless you had, and it comes back to like Ben was talking about minimum distances for all the other reasons, so light, water, things like that. From what we kind of worked out in the UK, if you wanted your trees close enough that the leaf drop was just naturally feeding all of the vegetables around it, you'd be in real problem ground for water robbery and nutrient robbery from the same trees, basically. So I think that, to emphasise what Ben said, the most creative, interesting part of that of providing nitrogen from trees is cut and carry in some way. Is whether that's just chipping it straight out over a green manure, or whether that's actually applying it around the bottom of each plant. Yeah, there's many different ways. Yeah.
At the back.
I suppose wonder about, so we've got like berry bushes amongst our agroforestry rows with apple trees. Now, 3 years later, wonder if it'll ever be a viable crop really. But I wondered, is there any successful stories of like kind of interplanted rows?
So that was a question about interplanting berry crops with trees. So we've done a bit of that at Eastbrook. And I've got some successes and some failures. I would say don't try and grow berry bushes under apricot trees because they've got very dense canopy and a spreading habit, and so basically there's no light at all. Whereas the raspberries under the almond trees, so almonds have a much more upright habit and a sort of more light foliage, also helped by the fact they quite often get frosted in the spring and lose a lot of their leaves, so that lets more light through. So actually the raspberries have done quite well under the almonds. So again, it's looking at what the tree is, how much light, raspberries are a bit more woodland edgy anyway, so they can cope with a bit less light. We interplanted quinces with sea buckthorn, and the quinces have been absolutely crap, and the sea buckthorn's been really good, so now it's actually massive sea buckthorn interplanted with small quince trees. So yes, I think it can work, but you probably need to leave a bit more space between the trees if you're thinking of putting a berry crop in. Or the other option is to have a row of trees and then a row of berries next to it, but you've then got the challenge of what you do with the bit in between. And if you leave it too wide, that's effectively wasted space, and if you don't leave it wide enough, you can't get in and manage it. But I can't remember if you've done
stuff. We're about to try and start. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is what we want to now. As our understory evolves, the ones that was just tusky grasses, great for slug control, beetles everywhere. They've done that job brilliantly, but they're starting to go from grassland into first stages of woodland. We don't want that. Lady Perfect talked about how hard it is to harvest apples from amongst brambles under a tree. And also they migrate out, the brambles will migrate out into the cropping area as well. When you're hand weeding and you wrap your hand around a bramble, it's not very nice. But one of the key little things, so when you look at the behaviour of trees, there's so much delicacy to this design, which I love, which is trees come out in leaf at different times. So some trees come out in leaf really late in the season. And in terms of some soft fruit, you can use that really well. In terms of strawberries, you know, there are some tree species which come out in leaf so late, you could almost have cropped your strawberries by the time they've come out, you know, especially if you closhed your strawberries or something like that. So just thinking that dynamic difference in like time, space and 3D with light, there's so much to play with there. It's very, very creative.
Have we got, how are we in for time? Okay, a couple more questions, yeah. So yeah.
I mean, I think because in an alley cropping.
Just repeat the question.
Oh yeah. Is there a particular way in which you prune the roots so that you don't kill the tree? I mean, it's a huge subject. You talk like in tree nurseries. Root pruning is like an everyday thing, different times of year, different purposes. It's not a subject I've mastered at all, but my understanding in terms of silvohorticulture is, I checked this with someone who knows a lot more about trees than me recently. If in an alley cropping system, if you are just cutting on either side of the tree row, you've still got, if you think about it, if you look from above, they're still going to have down the tree row, really good, totally natural. Their roots can do whatever they want at whatever depth they want and behave naturally. And the bits down either side where you're root pruning, it won't not root there, it just won't root in the area where you keep pruning. So it'll push its roots down underneath and still have access to all that soil. So I think, yeah, if you root prune, if you had one tree in the middle of a load of veg and you root pruned it all the way around as a circle, like every year, I imagine that'd be terrible for the tree. If it's just a set amount, I wouldn't go over like, you wouldn't want to go over 60%, maybe the root mass, 70%.
Like a design process because it's so complex a subject, like agroforestry always seems to me like kind of equal thing for all people. Like how do you set your objectives when you like kind of do this?
That is literally what the book is about. So from start, because of exactly that. So when Ben designed his system, when I designed my system, Tolly designed his system here. As far as like the only stuff you can look at for veg and horticulture, real life example in the UK was basically a couple of the alleys at Wakelins. That was the only decent data of UK veg and field scale agroforestry I could find. So that is literally why me and Ben wrote the book.
But you asked exactly the right question. You said, how do you set your objectives? And that is what you have to do, because every tree will deliver 100 different things. What is it that you want that tree to do? And that's the key bit. If you get that right in your head, everything else flows from that. You know, if your key thing is to produce nuts for the UK market, then you design your system around nuts. If your key thing is, to protect your summer salads from sun, then you design it around that. And obviously, you'll have lots of objectives. So then you've got to prioritise them and all that sort of stuff. So that's the difficult bit in a way. But once you've understood and prioritised your objectives, everything sort of flows from that a little bit. So, time for one more. So that was a question about Eastbrook. Yes, absolutely, we do visits. I can also, if people are really up for it, we can arrange a visit. Andy actually is about to set up one of our Soil Association agroforestry learning networks for horticultural agroforestry. I mean, nominally based around the Thames Valley, but anyone's welcome to go. So yeah, if people are interested to come and see that, well, I mean, I guess the same with Abbey Farm then.
And the other one is Agroforestry Open Weekend, is that right?
Yeah.
Open Weekend, which is organised every year. We do a purely agroforestry focused. Ben will be doing the same, I presume, on that day.
Yeah.
All the places that have got agroforestry really into it, there's every summer, it's every spring, I think, late spring, is it? May. Yeah, every May there's Agroforestry Open Weekend, and everyone puts kind of a bit of effort into opening their sites up, people to have a look around. We have handouts you can pick up in our shop, walk yourself around and look at everything. I do a couple of detailed tours, but just on agroforestry.
And I should also do a little plug for our agroforestry show next year as well, which is going to be the 10th and 11th of September on Wood Oaks Farm near London. So. there is horticultural agroforestry there. Ricky, the grower, there's doing some really interesting stuff with some quite unusual stuff for the UK climate, sort of persimmons and pawpaws and things. So yeah, it's worth it. Great. Oh, I'm sorry. I think if we were. Yeah, we're out. I'm so sorry, but Andy and I can hang around.
We'll be here for questions.
Thank you all very much.